We are taught that the United States and Great Britain are the closest of allies. We are told about the special relationship and the brotherhood of World War II. But the truth is that when the war ended, the United States did not save the British Empire. It foreclosed on it. This is the story of the ruthless financial war that Washington waged against London disguised as a helping hand. On the 8th of May, 1945, the crowds gathered in London. It was Victory in Europe Day. Winston Churchill stood on the balcony of Whitehall and waved to the cheering masses. The Union Jack was waving. The Nazi beast had been slain. To the average citizen, it looked like Britain's finest hour. They believed that they had won the war. But inside the Treasury building, just a few streets away, there was no cheering. There was only panic. The civil servants and the economists looked at the ledgers and they saw a terrifying reality. Britain had not won the war. It had merely survived it. And the price of survival was total bankruptcy. To fight Hitler, Britain had sold everything. They had sold their overseas investments. They had sold their railways in Argentina. They had emptied their gold reserves. They had gone from being the world's greatest creditor to the world's greatest debtor. But they weren't worried. They thought they had a safety net. They thought they had the United States. Throughout the war, the U.S. had supplied Britain with food, oil, and weapons through a program called Lend-Lease. It was essentially free stuff. President Roosevelt had compared it to lending a garden hose to a neighbor whose house was on fire. You don't ask for payment while the fire is burning. The British assumed that because they had fought alone in 1940 and 1941, because they had taken the bombs and the Blitz, that the Americans would treat them with generosity. They expected a grant. They expected a gift to help rebuild the nation that had stood as the shield of democracy. They were wrong. On August 21st, 1945, just days after the defeat of Japan, President Harry Truman signed a piece of paper that hit London harder than a V-2 rocket. Without warning, without negotiation, the United States canceled Lend-Lease. The flow of free food and oil stopped instantly. There were British ships crossing the Atlantic filled with American wheat. They were ordered to turn around or pay cash. Britain had no cash. Lord John Maynard Keynes, the greatest economist of the 20th century and the man who was trying to save the British economy, called it a financial Dunkirk. The British government realized they had weeks, perhaps months, before the country literally ran out of food. They had to go to Washington. They had to beg. So in September 1945, a dying John Maynard Keynes boarded a ship to America. He was sick. He had a heart condition. But he was the only man who could negotiate with the Americans. He went with a sense of moral superiority. He believed that he could walk into the U.S. Treasury and explain that Britain had sacrificed its blood and treasure for the common cause. He believed the Americans would offer a free gift of $6 billion as a thank you. When he arrived in Washington, he found a very different atmosphere. The mood in the U.S. Congress had changed. The war was over. The American taxpayer was tired of paying for Europe. There was a feeling that the British Empire was an old rival that needed to be put in its place. The American negotiators led by Fred Vinson were not interested in gratitude. They were interested in business. And they were interested in dismantling the British Empire. They looked at the British delegation and said, "We will not give you a grant. We will give you a loan, and you will pay interest on it." Keynes was shocked. He argued that Britain had held the line while America was still neutral. He argued that charging interest on the blood spilled at El Alamein and Normandy was a moral outrage. The Americans didn't care. They offered a loan of $3.75 billion. It was barely enough to survive. And the interest rate was 2%. But the interest wasn't the real trap. The real trap was in the fine print. The United States attached two brutal conditions to the loan. These conditions were designed specifically to destroy Britain's status as a global superpower and to pry open its markets for American corporations. The first condition was the destruction of the sterling area. For a century, the British Empire had operated as a closed economic bloc. Countries like Australia, India, and South Africa traded in pound sterling. They bought British goods because it was easy and cheap. It was a protective wall that kept American goods out. The U.S. negotiators said, if you want this money, you have to dismantle that wall. You have to end imperial preference. They forced Britain to sign a clause promising to support free trade. This sounds innocent, but in practice it meant that American car manufacturers and American farmers could flood the markets of the British colonies. It was a hostile takeover of Britain's customer base. The second condition was even deadlier. It was called sterling convertibility. This is a technical term, but it is the weapon that actually killed the British economy. During the war, Britain had strict capital controls. If a merchant in Argentina sold beef to Britain, he got paid in pounds, but he couldn't take those pounds and exchange them for US dollars. He had to spend them in Britain or in the Empire. This forced money to stay within the British system. The Americans demanded that Britain make the pound fully convertible into dollars within 1 year of receiving the loan. Keynes warned them. He said it was suicide. He said the British economy was too weak. He said that if you let people exchange pounds for dollars, everyone would dump the pound and buy dollars because the US was the only country producing things people actually wanted to buy. The Americans refused to budge. They said, take it or leave it. Keynes was desperate. He knew that without the loan, the British people would face starvation. The ration in 1945 was already lower than it had been during the war, so he signed. He signed the death warrant of the British financial system to buy bread for the British people. He returned to London a broken man. He tried to sell the deal to the House of Commons. He told them it was the best he could do. Winston Churchill, who was now in the opposition, voted against it, calling it a degradation of the British nation. But the government had no choice. Parliament ratified the loan in December 1945. For a few months, things seemed okay. The American money started flowing. Britain bought machinery, they bought oil, they bought wheat. But the clock was ticking. The one-year deadline for convertibility was approaching. On July 15, 1947, strictly following the American condition, Britain made the pound convertible. The result was an immediate catastrophe. It was exactly what Keynes had predicted. The world was hungry for dollars. Every country that held British pounds, from France to Argentina to Australia, immediately ran to the Bank of England and said, take these pounds and give us US dollars. They didn't want to buy British goods. British industry was bombed out and recovering. They wanted to buy American fridges and American cars and American steel. The loan that was supposed to last for 5 years began to evaporate. In the first week, Britain lost millions. By the second week, it was a hemorrhage. The Bank of England was bleeding gold in dollars at a rate that was unsustainable. The British government begged the US to let them suspend convertibility. The US said no, you signed the contract. For 6 weeks, the run on the pound continued. It was a financial slaughter. The entire $3.75 billion loan was being drained away not to rebuild Britain, but to finance the deficits of other countries who were using London as a currency exchange to buy American goods. Finally, in August 1947, with the Treasury almost empty, the British government unilaterally suspended convertibility. They broke the agreement because the alternative was total national collapse. But the damage was done. The loan was mostly gone. Britain was back to square one, but now they had a massive debt to the United States, and they had shown the world that the pound was weak. The crisis of 1947 was the moment the world realized that the British Empire was over. Before 1947, people thought Britain was still a Big Three power. After 1947, everyone knew Britain was a client state of the USA. The consequences for the British people were severe. Because the loan had been wasted, Britain had to impose austerity measures that were even stricter than during the Nazi bombing. Bread was rationed in 1946. Bread had never been rationed during the war, not even when the U-boats were sinking the supply ships. But the American loan terms forced the government to take bread out of the mouths of the people. Building materials were rationed. Clothing was rationed. The British people who had fought and won the war looked around and asked, why are we poorer now than when we were fighting Hitler? The answer was that they were paying for the transition of global power. The United States had effectively used the loan to strip mine the British economy. By forcing the end of the sterling area, they captured the markets of the empire. By forcing convertibility, they asserted the dominance of the dollar. This was not an accident. This was the strategy. There's a quote from a U.S. Treasury official at the time who said, Britain is broke. It's time we pick up the bits. They picked up the bits very well. In the years following the loan, the U.S. economy boomed. The post-war golden age of American capitalism was built partly on the access to global markets that had previously been closed by the British. Meanwhile, Britain entered a long, slow decline. They became the sick man of Europe. And the debt remained. The Anglo-American Loan was a commercial debt. Every year for decades, the British government had to write a check to the U.S. Treasury. There were years when the British economy was in recession and they asked to defer the payment. The U.S. allowed a few deferrals, but the interest kept accumulating. It became a generational burden. The children of the men who fought on D-Day paid that debt. The grandchildren of the men who fought on D-Day paid that debt. It was not until December 29th, 2006, 6 decades after the war ended, that the British government finally transferred the last payment of $83 million to the United States. It was a quiet news day. Most people didn't notice, but it marked the official end of World War II for Britain. For 60 years, the United Kingdom had been paying a mortgage on its own survival to its closest ally. The story of the predatory loan teaches us a very hard lesson about international relations. We like to believe in friendship between nations. We like to believe in shared values and common heritage. But nations do not have friends. They have interests. The United States in 1945 was not acting out of malice. It was acting out of rational self-interest. It saw a rival empire that was wounded, and it took the opportunity to finish it off. It saw a closed trading bloc that blocked American profits, and it used the leverage of debt to pry it open. It is the golden rule of geopolitics. He who has the gold makes the rules. The British learned this lesson the hard way. They learned that you cannot rely on the gratitude of others. You cannot rely on the moral high ground. When you're in debt, you're a servant to the lender. The decline of the British Empire wasn't just about losing India or losing Africa. It was about losing the ledger. It was about the shift of financial gravity from the city of London to Wall Street. And that shift was engineered. It was written into the clauses of a contract that a sick old man was forced to sign in Washington because his country was running out of flour. John Maynard Keynes died just a few months after negotiating the loan. The stress of the negotiation killed him. His biographer wrote that he died for his country just as surely as any soldier on the battlefield. He died trying to fight a new kind of war, a war of currencies and interest rates. Today, we see similar dynamics playing out in the world. We see rising superpowers offering loans to developing nations. We call it debt trap diplomacy. We criticize it. But we should remember that the masters of debt trap diplomacy were not the Chinese in the 21st century. They were the Americans in 1946. The Anglo-American Loan was the original debt trap. It caught a lion and turned it into a poodle. So the next time you hear politicians talk about the unbreakable bond between the US and the UK, remember the year 1946. Remember the bread rationing. Remember the run on the pound. And remember that the price of salvation is often higher than the price of war. This is Tom from the Collapse Log. History is written by the victors, but the accounting is kept by the creditors. And the creditors never forget.